Okay, good evening and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for our program, What's Happening in Our Schools. I'm Kathy Nagel. I'm the chair of the Education Committee of the League of Women Voters of Greater Pittsburgh, and I'll also be your hostess for this evening's program. We are so delighted to have with us Dr. Jerry Zahorchak as our distinguished speaker. Dr. Zahorchak holds a Bachelor of Science degree from St. Francis College, a Master of Education degree from the Indiana University of Pennsylvania, and a doctoral degree in education administration from Penn State. Dr. Zahorchak also earned 2 honorary Doctor of Law degrees, one from the University of Philadelphia School of Osteopathic Medicine and one from IUP, an honor that has been bestowed on only 50 others in the university's history. Dr. Zahorchak's career in education includes teaching and leadership experience at both the elementary and secondary levels. He has served in the North Star, Shanksville, Stony Creek, Greater Johnstown, and Allentown school districts. At Greater Johnstown and Allentown, he served as the district superintendent. In 2003, Dr. Zahorchak was named Deputy Secretary for Elementary and Secondary Education for the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. 2 years later, Governor Rendell chose Dr. Zahorchak to serve as the state's Secretary of Education, a position he held through May of 2010. In this role, he was responsible for the education of nearly 2 million children across the Commonwealth. Dr. Zahorchak is a national education leader focused on Common Core standards and implementing standards-based education to improve student achievement. Under his direction, Pennsylvania transformed schools, enabling more than 3/4 of all students to demonstrate proficiency in reading and mathematics, as compared to slightly more than half in 2002. A hallmark of Dr. Zahorchak's distinguished career is the development of the standards-aligned system that combines research and best practices to ensure student achievement. With the creation of an educational portal to support the standards-aligned system, unprecedented resources are now available to Pennsylvania educators. Dr. Zahorchak has been widely published, is a frequent speaker at national educational conferences, symposia, and other forums, and is a frequent guest on Pennsylvania public television and radio stations. He is currently the Education Division Chair at the University of Pittsburgh at Johnstown, a position he has held since 2016. On behalf of the League of Women Voters of Greater Pittsburgh, I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to you, Dr. Zahorchak, and thank you so much for being here.
Thanks, Kathy, very much for having me tonight. And thanks to all of you for joining in with us as this conversation unfolds. I hope to impress upon you that the outlook for education, of course, is good. It's the cornerstone, I think, the elixir for all that ails our world. So I'm, again, really pleased to be here. I had a student the other day in one of my classes say, "Hey, do you know Dr. Zahorchak has a Wikipedia page?" And someone developed that after I left Harrisburg and continued for the most part and through Allentown School District experience, and then it stopped, but it is there and some of those accomplishments are there. However, I think one of the things I most enjoy reading in that Wikipedia page is a part that says he was respected by Republicans and Democrats alike on educational matters. So I really like that. And I was one of 2 cabinet members that had unanimous support in terms of getting the position approved by the Senate. So those are things that I enjoy because I think right now in our country, well, here we are, and I think you can connect those dots, all of you. Here we are. And so we need to open up, and talking about opening up, Kathy, I'll bring back to you, and thanks again for having me. Thanks for the invitation.
We're so happy to have you here and really looking forward to hearing your insights and perspectives on education. And before I turn the program over to Dr. Zahorchak, I'd just like to run through the format so everybody knows what to expect. So we've chosen 5 main education topics. And after a quick lead-in for each topic, I'll turn the floor over to Dr. Zahorchak, and he'll discuss each topic for about 7 minutes. And then I'll ask a few follow-up questions after each topic before we move on to the next. So we'll be spending about 10 minutes per topic. And if you, our attendees, have any questions, please feel free to type them into the chat. Dr. Zahorchak will answer as many questions as time allows at the end of the talk. Okay, we're ready to begin. And our first topic is funding. We know that funding is an important factor that directly impacts student achievement. In order for our students to be successful, we need funding that is fair and equitable. Could you please share your thoughts with us, Dr. Zahorchak, on funding of our public schools?
Yeah, it's complicated. And sometimes I appeared before the House and Senate during their Appropriations Committee hearings. And after explaining, two vocabulary words conceptually, I'm not sure that everybody understood. And so that's a teacher's job, an educator's job to make sure that people are definitely understanding the basics of school funding. The first thing I think that's important more than anything else is, do we know an adequate amount of money that's necessary for all students to come to grade level? So when you graduate students with a diploma, the diploma is not empty. It indicates that they have met basic education. And we mean that for all students. And I love saying all means all, no exceptions for background or situation or disability or ability, no exception for background and race and the things that go along with the background of a student. So it doesn't matter if you're African-American or Latino or Caucasian or Asian, all means all. Same thing with the situation. It shouldn't matter where a student comes from, what their zip code is, to expect that student's going to reach grade level and to be able to have the capacity to do so. And the same thing with abilities and or disabilities. All means all, again, regardless of background, situation, disability. So one big key vocabulary word in this conversation we're having is about adequacy. Do we have enough in each school district to do so? And how would we know? And how would we know question came about from the state legislature while I was serving in Harrisburg. The legislature ordered an adequacy study. They said, we want to know, how much would it take in, Stowe Rocks compared to North Allegheny or Mount Lebanon? How much money per child would it take? And there were multiple ways of looking at that question, multiple methods, and they used them all. There was Augenblick was the company. They're well reputed for financial studies. They studied this state district by district, literally child by child in terms of need to get students to grade level. They determined the inadequacy would cost about $4 billion, not all coming from the state, some of it coming from local effort, where school districts, were reluctant to raise the taxes that they had the capability of doing, but it's a match between the two. So that study was continued on, put into legislation eventually in terms of getting to adequacy, and the expectations for increasing the knowledge about adequacy year by year since that study was also in legislation, although it waned in terms of interest. But we've learned a great deal, and Penn State still does update that adequacy information for us. And today, we're about $4.6 billion short. So one question was adequacy. The second most important question of the questions you could ask about school funding is the term equity. So what about school districts that are doing a great job of taxing their assessed value of properties, yet still don't have the funds that the studies have said their school district would need? And studies that were based on, who are the students? How many of a variety of types of students do you have? For example, how many students do you have in dire poverty? I call it census poor. That means 100% of the poverty match determined by the federal government or below, in many cases, way below that. So a family of four with, $15,000 or $12,000 just are going to have a more difficult time. So are the teachers. Not difficult because of the child, difficult because of the capacity to help the child, and especially if you have some density in terms of the number of students in that condition. So the first criteria would be how many students in dire poverty, how many students in low income, and we hear those numbers a lot, low income. That's typically the free and reduced lunch numbers, and that's multiples of that true poverty figure. So low income, dire poverty, how many students do you have in the district that at home have a language other than English as the primary language? That becomes a capacity issue of trying to get almost one-to-one with the students. So those kinds of factors. As a matter of fact, after we left and the corporate administration came in, they not only disregarded the funding goals, they actually determined that the budget was too heavy with cash and that we were spending more than enough money. And about $1 billion of the funding that was coming out towards that adequacy number was removed. And districts that had the least capability in terms of ability to raise property taxes based on their assessed values of their properties suffered the most. There was districts that lost during that time $2,000 per child. And they were in Allegheny County, many of those districts. So what they did with equity, they formed a commission at the end. Governor Wolf signed a piece of legislation. They look at weighted students. So now you get more weight. Problem is with the weighted results, you have only new money that comes out going through a formula that has been passed now through the Balance Commission by the Wolf administration, and then we're using it now, a very equitable formula. However, there's, again, not an adequate amount of money. So I hope you understand those terms. And I went quickly with the review of the new formula. If that formula was writ large and you put in the $4 billion, we would have a school system second to none. By the way, New Jersey, in response to a lawsuit, is second to none right now, according to Ed Weeks. Look at state school systems. And I have to tell you, there is a lawsuit going on, and you can learn more about that lawsuit in plenty of places. Fund Our Schools PA is one of the places, but you can also look at the other side's point of view. The Commonwealth Foundation has a point of view on this as well. And it's the school districts, including rural school districts, suing the government of Pennsylvania. It started in 2014. It's starting to unfold now. The trial will actually start this coming Friday.
Okay, thank you. One of the terms we hear when it comes to funding is hold harmless. Could you talk about hold harmless in regard to the funding and the funding formula? And has that really promoted the unfair system that we have?
Well, it exacerbated the system. I mean, we have a very inadequate system before 1992. But since then, what we said was, in law, whatever a school district has, we'll freeze it there. We'll hold you harmless. You won't lose anything from there or gain more than somebody else or less than somebody else from there. So if the funding for education was raised by 3%, you'd share that across the board based on 1992 funding levels. So if your school district gained population or changed demographically and got poorer or more ESL students or those criteria, it didn't matter. So the bulk of the money is focused on hold harmless. 90+% of the money is still there. So the money is in a place where it didn't shift like the school districts, in some cases shifted by gaining population, losing population, changing demographically. So we held harmless, and only new money, if they add money to the budget, comes out through an equitable formula that was done by a really positive commission of Republicans and Democrats, led by the appropriations chair, Pat Brown of Lehigh. It was a really good, fair, balanced commission, but problem is they adopted it, but they adopted it only for the new payouts, exacerbated by some of the payments we're making now to charter schools like never before.
I have one more follow-up question on funding. So there are two programs that received an increase in the most current state budget, and those programs were the Educational Improvement Tax Credit Program and the Opportunity Scholarship Tax Credit Program. Could you talk about those programs and discuss any impact they might have on public school funding?
Sure, those are two programs that instead of a business paying state taxes, they can pay towards programs that are loosely defined for scholarships into any type of school, public, private, etc., or initiatives for any public or private school. So the education tax credit, for example, schools apply, they have so much money for priorities given to the first people applying, and their businesses in that community, instead of paying state taxes to help with the adequacy problem, for one example, their money gets diverted to these special programs. And in my view, nothing wrong with that if you're going to give capacity in adequate amounts to the public schools. So you can do that all you like, as much as you like. It's fair, it's legal, should support it even. Let's help all children no matter where they are. However, if you know you've created a system that really is detrimental to children who most need your help, and by the way, that's plenty, hundreds of our schools, virtually all of our schools are underfunded when it comes to adequacy. So now you have a diversion, which would be okay if you were funding adequately in your public education system.
Thank you. Thank you for the discussion on funding. We'll move on now to our next topic, charter schools and cyber charter schools. The issues surrounding charter schools seem to evoke strong opinions and responses, as we know. Proponents believe they provide parents and students with options, while critics maintain that charter and cyber charter schools take already limited funds away from existing schools. Dr. Zahorchak, I'll turn this topic over to you for more discussion.
Yeah, the charter school movement was a pretty fair and balanced beginning. People, on both sides of the aisle were interested in having improvements to schools and using these charter ideas as in twofold. One, how can we provide a charter from a district to a public education system? One purpose was some of our schools, like in Philadelphia, were 3,000 and 4,000 students in a high school. Can we break that up? I remember having that conversation with Paul Vallis, and they have a charter school committee there, commission that looks at the applications of the school district. The school districts determine whether or not to approve a charter, and then they pay their district tuition to that charter when students choose that as a public option. So that's still, the time of saying that's debatable is, of course, we can still debate that, but there are some regular charter schools, rather brick and mortar charter schools that are doing pretty well. And I can name some of them. There are some that are, dismal, and there should be more and more ways to take back. And with a charter appeals board, sometimes the school district residents don't really approve their charter schools, because when they get rejected locally, they go in front of a charter appeals board, and that board takes whatever temperament they do, and they can approve in spite of the school district saying, no, this is not a charter we wanted. Some of the charters, again, are doing a fairly good job in terms of the brick and mortar. If I move to, I testified twice, most recently in 2019 in front of the Senate, testified in front of the House and Senate on cyber charter schools and trying to change the rules regarding cyber charter schools. I think if the public catches on, because right now 99% of the public, in my opinion, doesn't understand what's going on in the cyber world. They don't understand the fact that we have to pay the cyber charter school the same amount that we would pay a brick and mortar charter school, that we pay, that the state has designated as our rate of tuition for basic education. And then if it's a special education student, of course, that becomes much more, regardless of what the disability is for the child. So a child could be receiving limited services, maybe once every 2 weeks, and get the same amount of money that the average child would be getting in that particular school district. And then it's also exacerbated in terms of illogical funding from the state's decision that it's the school district by district by district's tuition rate and special education cost. So if you come from Greater Johnstown, where I'm from, the school district may pay $8,000 for a basic education student and then pay $15,000 or $18,000 for the special education student, even if the student's only getting 1 day a week of a half hour of services. So it's not dependent on the type of disability. It's really a illogical system. But if you come from, let's say, Upper St. Clair or North Allegheny, or a good school district to use is Upper Marion near Philadelphia. The special ed child from Philadelphia's Upper Marion, not Philadelphia, but Upper Marion School District, is $53,000. Same as what Johnstown's getting for the same type of disabled child for far less than that. So you see what's happening? And here's what also is happening. And this is the part that the public needs to understand. It doesn't cost a lot of money. By all people, everybody, the Republicans and Democrats that have studied this says it doesn't cost that much to do cyber education. We found that out in remote education, but a lot of school districts have cyber education systems within the school district. We know, even the conservative groups have said this thing costs at most about $9,000 per child, regardless of type of student. And if you say that and you're paying $50,000 or $25,000 per child, what's happening? There's a profit to be made. A lot of these people who are involved in this have engineered systems that they aren't the cyber necessarily, but they provide the curriculum. For example, K-12 cyber charter school, great lobbying group, has done a good job in Pennsylvania, Ohio, California rather, where most of the cyber charter school comes from, and we have probably the loosest law in terms of how we make payments and hold accountable and allow them to occur. So the profit margin in some of those places, well, think about this. K-12's got 80,000 students, and that's before the pandemic, that they serve through their systems. Philadelphia has 140,000. Philadelphia's superintendent makes about $450,000, $500,000. That's outrageous in some of the community parts. That's a lot of money, but for a CEO of a $4 billion school district, that's reasonable, in my view. The CEO for the K-12 made $26 million, all taxpayer-funded salary money, and then tells Wall Street, don't worry, we can bring you more. So think about that in terms of if the public knew, because most people do say, I didn't know that. I bet you 99% of the people would say, I didn't know how these cyber charters in Pennsylvania are funded. Most states, 22 states allow cyber charters. Most states will say, if you want to do that, we'll treat it like a private school. You can do it, but you're on your own. We have the world campus #2 cyber charter higher ed system in our state. It's second to Arizona's higher ed cyber school, we could have one university or one agency responsible for all cyber, but we don't. And when you bring these matters, and there's plenty of matters related to this, when you bring these to the committees, they're serious about listening, but there's not been any action yet. So more than 300 school districts have signed a petition saying, look, we want to change in the way we fund cyber charter school. If it's an option, it should be a good option. Final message on cyber, it's not a good option because Penn State studies and Stanford studies on Pennsylvania, if you stay a year in a cyber charter school in mathematics, you lose a year's worth of educational value. You don't stay the same if you're a ninth grader. You become an eighth grader in terms of grade proficiency, you'll lose a year's worth of educational value. So there are plenty more issues on that topic, but a good topic.
Just a follow-up question. So the Department of Education released a set of regulations that I believe went through the Independent Regulatory Review Commission for a 30-day public comment, and now they're back to PDE. As I read through those, they seem to deal mostly with the financial or fiscal accountability issues with charter schools, but nothing on academic accountability. And that's one of the criticisms, especially of cyber charter schools. How can we improve, or what suggestions would you have to hold charter schools accountable for academic performance?
Yeah, there's even the entry, even the charter schools organization nationally talk about the entry enrollment criteria is needed. So if we know that if I were like 11 and growing up, and somebody said, "Look, you don't even have to go to school, and I'll buy you a computer. You get everything except the pony." And I say that comically, you know what I mean? You don't have to go to school and I'll buy you. And we know that this option that we're paying a lot for and getting results that are dismal. So one of the suggestions of many groups is an enrollment criteria. The National Alliance for Public Charter Schools that is out there suggesting this. On the enrollment criteria, they're saying we need to have some screening criteria that says for this student, it would work. And there are students in homeschool situation and other school situations where this might be a good option, where their caregiver is capable and able of monitoring daily the activities that would go on with an online curriculum. This is a pretty nice attribute for the people who are in homeschooling and very serious about homeschooling. Unfortunately, there's people in homeschooling that want to just escape or not be seen and avoid compulsory education. There are two bills regarding the financing, one in the Senate, one in the House, that are there. But I'll bet you'll hear the same thing that we've been hearing, and that's this.
Do you think having a flat tuition rate across the state would solve a lot of the funding issues?
Yeah, and that's been proposed, and it is still proposed at about $9,000, which is still a fairly good margin for those interested in margins. But I think that once people on the park benches sit down and say, "Do you know?" that's when we'll get action, because no one will stand in front of the public sentiment wave, even if they're being lobbied hard. They're not going to stand when the wave of the public sentiment comes at them. But until the public really knows, we know, and we all talk to each other. But thing is, we haven't been good yet at communicating to the park benches.
Thank you. So we'll move on to our next topic, curriculum issues. And I have to say, I was a director of curriculum and instruction at the time that you were Secretary of Education. And it was really great to have the standards aligned system and the PA Common Core standards, because they gave us benchmarks for student achievement. Could you share with us your perspectives on what's happening with curriculum today? And if you would, include a topic that we are hearing a lot about lately, and that is critical race theory.
Oh, good. I was saving that for the challenges, but that's something that I'll talk about. First of all, standards-based means we have a broad standard that moves vertically, practically in our state, luckily because of early childhood involvement. Our standard system goes from birth to a grade level, what we consider basic education. And I think we have to remind ourselves when talking curriculum that we are basic education. So people want us to be all things to all people, and they want us to get fancy and all of this. We're the basic education curriculum. What does that mean? So we've thought about that in terms of the disciplines. Ultimately, our state measures of most disciplines are determined by the local school district, save starting with the class of 2023 now, Algebra 1, literature, and biology, which will be measured by keystone exams. So there's sort of an exit ticket saying this diploma that we're about to hand to a student has met the basic literacy for these disciplines. I think once a student meets those basic literacy, even if they're in fourth grade and they meet them, then we're on to pathways like college and high school, pathways like AP courses, pathways like technical preparation to get to MIT, pathways like trades for many, many of our students. But no one wants a plumber or a carpenter that comes into your house and isn't very good at the basic fundamental education things that we all believe are fundamental. There's another, when I think about curriculum, Kathy, I think in the architecture for curriculum. And that was my job as secretary. I said, look, we need to have two things. We need to have human development, call it behavior, call it whatever, human development, and then the academic standards and big ideas, concepts, and competencies for both. We need to know what we should be doing universally with that curriculum set of expectations, standards-based. And then we need to know how to intervene for students who aren't making it, and then really intervene with students who are seriously struggling. And in school districts, we should set that kind of three-tier process in our heads that we're going to universally have the best programs we can have, supported by enough capacity from the adequate amount of funding, and then do the same thing for the tutoring at level 2 and the one-on-one almost tutoring at level 3. So as I think of curriculum, I think of it in two things. The human development part is now part of this critical race theory set of what are they doing in your schools? I'm not sure where it's coming from, but it's real. So we have to address it. We have to listen. What do you mean? What are we doing in the school? So we can answer you. The part of human development is also, they're now saying, and you're going to hear things like SEL, social emotional learning. Social emotional learning is that human development stuff. The push against critical race theory is also starting to include that. It reminds me of the outcome-based education world that I was a younger fellow interested in understanding that. But when we look at human development, we're saying we need more understanding from ed psych, like my professor online. We need more understanding about mental health. We need more understanding about what does the workforce require or colleges require after school. For example, we need to say this was really a very conservative idea, and it's a good idea. George H.W. Bush commissioned a study of the Department of Labor, and they called it the Secretary's Commission Assessing Necessary Skills in 1991. So in 1991, they had, what should we know? This was SCAN's report. They really talked about some basic things like all students should be able to read and write and do basic computation and mathematics and listen. They should have good thinking skills and creativity. Think about this: making decisions, problem solving, seeing things in the mind's eye, knowing how to learn, and reasoning. And then they should have personal qualities, ability to understand self and self-esteem and sociability, understand others, self-management, self-control, and integrity. These are all in the 1991 SCANS report. This isn't new. SEL and resiliency, those kinds of things have been studied since the 1960s and still are. A great website today to get an understanding of academic and social emotional together is the Center for Academic and Social Emotional Learning. We have to be careful to bring people along because the SCANS report morphed into 21st century skills. Our major corporations and many other businesses, they want a certain type of worker and they want one that has self-control, can get along, and those things can be learned and it can be taught. Meanwhile, we need as much support as we can get. So we begin with these broad standards. We go vertically. We teach students where they're at on the vertical in each discipline, and we respond with interventions and we try to move them along. It's the same thing as well for behavior. We don't say there are children who just don't fit. That was, that's an antiquated proposition. Suspension leads to expulsion. Expulsion leads the pipeline to failure. Pipeline to failure is costly, either by incarceration or by lack of productivity. And the lack of productivity can cost us well over $100,000 or $200,000 per student per year for the rest of their lives. So we got to double down on this education thing for the sake of our own well-being and economy. That's why I care about living in Johnstown, a kid in Reading, or a kid in Erie, or a kid in the Poconos. I care very, very much that they're all successful because that's our state's productivity.
I'm sure we've all seen the reports or read the reports, have seen it on the news of parents and community members being upset at school board meetings over what they think is being taught in the schools. To what extent, and I know parents are stakeholders, of course, in the educational process, but to what extent should parents drive curriculum issues?
I think it's come back to the resiliency question. What is this resiliency thing? One part of it is, what does the district expect? Clearly, as a community, local control. What does our school board elected representatives with the parents' involvement think the parents' involvement should be? What are the expectations and are they high enough? The second part of a resiliency wheel, in my mind, goes to meaningful participation. Parents are tired of just being, hey, raise some money for us, do a bake sale, and we'll put it to good use. They want to be involved in policy matters and curriculum matters and understanding the assessment systems. It's an opportunity more than it's a threat, in my view, when parents say we want more involvement. When the study was done on this idea of parents are so upset, and it's critical race theory in Virginia that led, the exit polling and the polling that's been going on beyond for months and months at a time leading up to and continuing, the National Parent Unions poll was pretty clear in saying, look, they value their school system. They're most upset. They're even hoping that diversity is taught and we get involved with understanding how we do interpersonal work. They're hoping for those things. They're not opposed to them, regardless of what we're led to believe. They're majority, but also the upset part came from COVID. You're keeping me out of schools. Why don't you want to be in school? Why are you making us do certain things and you didn't even come? So that confusion caused a lot of parents to be upset, and still does. They wanted their children in the schools. They wanted us to figure it out. And by the way, they had a great distaste for this online learning. over 80% of the parents surveyed say, look, I think my child is psychologically getting damaged from this. 80% are worried about the anxiety, or worried about depression, or worried about things that might come from that, based on what we went through with all this remote education. Really, it's no one's fault. We have to surrender to the idea that that was a real pandemic. We're still in the midst of it, and we did what we did. We need to get back on track.
That's a good segue. Next topic is actually COVID safety, and you touched on that somewhat just now, but COVID cases, quarantines, remote learning, the pandemic continues to impact our school system. Can you spend some more time talking about the impact that the pandemic has had on our schools?
Yeah, I think better than me was the McKinsey and Company. They did the studied effect of COVID-19 on education. In a report, it was subtitled "The Lingering Effects of Unfinished Business," published July of 2021. So they looked at this McKinsey study. They found out, as looking particularly at a state at a time, and really focusing and saying this is probably generalizable from the study they did, but there was a great learning loss because of COVID. Now put that in, put that on top of what remote learning and what we've learned from cyber generally. But because of COVID, the general population studied lost about 5 months worth of mathematics and 4 months of reading, and the gaps for subgroups got greater. For African-American, Latino students, for students, especially the greatest of all gaps widening because of this was the low-income families, the low-income students. The dropout likeliness rose for the low-income students, and the predictability of them going on to college based on what we generally predict whether or not the student's going to go to college has become less and less likely. Here's a fact that they looked at economically, and they describe it very well in their report. They believe this generation, when the COVID generation gets into the workforce from K to 12, from the setbacks of that, it's going to cost us about $180 billion lost productivity every year that those students remain in the workforce. So that's a significant coming attraction. If we don't figure out how to intervene, in my view, that's what we need to do. We have the data, again, from the virtual charter studies, now exacerbated by the data that we got from this McKinsey study. I think the call to action is getting people to realize what happened, accepting the fact that we have to surrender to it's really no one's fault, that an education system needs to be just that, systematized. Our state has done a good job, as you pointed out, with standards aligned systems. We have good supports in place, continue to have something that was built to last. But we need to figure out, here's my engagement call to action, like let's stay in person and be with students. Let's teach to that vertical alignment of standards. So you're coming to third grade, but as your diagnoses go, I see that in lots of places, you're right at the first grade level, and I'm going to take you from there. And I'm going to have students who didn't have poor gains, and we're just going to keep going up the vertical. So we have all this big ideas, concepts, content in this SAS system. So we don't have to worry about what grade level are you coming to. We're going to look at cohorts of students in my class as a teacher, and I'm going to differentiate 3 times. I'm going to say, here's the ones that really lost, and I know where I'm taking them. None of them are going to lose the third grade standards, the big ideas, but the means to those big ideas will be differentiated according to the ability or loss of ability from COVID. But the beauty of the SAS system, we know the vertical. So we don't have to worry what grade am I teaching, and getting the development into the teachers is going to help that. We also have to intervene for mental health. And I think the PBIS, the positive behavior intervention systems with those tiers of interventions, including much more psychological human development training for staff and for faculty especially. And then bringing in mental health experts, but don't rely on them. We have 25 teachers for every one mental health expert that we can afford to bring into the schools. We all need to be taking responsibility to understand human development more and more so that we can join the mental health community. Our business is human development. I mean, that's it. We're with humans all day. We draw up good plans and we find out, just like basketball coaches or football coaches or field hockey coaches, the other team doesn't care what our plan is. They're playing too. So we have to understand that when it comes to an education in the classroom, that it's not a one size fits all plan. And especially when it comes to human development, they're going to come in all kinds of stages. We just have to understand it better. And then we have to embrace the positive that came out of this. A lot of positives came out, I believe. We're using learning management systems like never before. We have not computer systems that are working instead of our teachers, but assisting our educators. So computer assisted instruction has been around for a long time. I think now we're starting to embrace it more and more because we're forced into some systems. And then we have meetings like this, web-based meetings that, parent can't make it. Yeah, how about tonight? How about the MDT? Can you make it during 50 minutes of your lunch period as opposed to driving from your work site and then driving back and the meeting? So we can do a lot more with meetings that generally involve parents and community members through these kinds of things. This is not the way to do education, though. But we got to say that over and over. We know that. And so the cyber schools approach, again, becomes a challenge or an opportunity if we can change it.
So it sounds like having an individualized education plan for every student might be the best way to help them if they have lost instructional time during the pandemic.
As long as it involves a child not doing it on their own, Mark Zuckerberg's idea of this mass customization and then go on your own and have prescriptions, that failed with open classrooms back in the 60s, if you recall. It was that IPI approach. Everybody has a prescription and now go do the worksheets. I don't think that's the approach when we say individualized. There needs to be teacher instruction, correction of misinformation, et cetera, the whole way up through. Not to disparage people who are attempting to try that because they took up that challenge. I'm saying individualized by knowing the diagnosis. And then I'm always thinking some special education folks believe it too. You really have 3 children in the class, even if you have 40. You have the children that are grouped in small groups based on what discipline you're talking about and their needs. You have students at about the grade level, and you have students who are way above it. But the standard doesn't change for any one of those 3 students. The standard, if we're talking about transitions in our writing class and writing good transitions between paragraphs, we don't change that because a kid in 4th grade came from some country that didn't have compulsory education and is scribbling, but can talk 4 languages. He's scribbling, we got to take him up the vertical to picture drawing, eventually to inventive spelling, eventually to, meanwhile, we are verbalizing with that student the standard, the big idea. We transition between ideas. That student will get that. And so we don't give up on the standard. It's the same for all students. The means to making incremental advancement, because by the way, that same student from that country without compulsory education, let's say Haiti, that same student would be in our school system. Some people would delightfully just mark the word or the letter F on everything he's doing, and it'd still be a scribbler at the end. And not even talking about transitions, right? Just there. It's not the way to do education. We do it in an individualized way, as you suggest. but I think we do it in a way that we can approach it for real, because trying to do 40 different students, that's an impossible thing.
So more of a differentiated instruction, I guess.
Yeah, that's what I call it, Kath.
Thank you. So before we take some questions from the chat, I would just like to ask you what you see as the greatest challenge facing our schools today, as well as the greatest opportunity.
Yeah, I think the greatest challenge we have right now is the mental health, anxiety, depression of our youth. More than any other generation, this generation is telling us that's their number one problem when they're asked about their friends. If you had a list of problems that your friend is having, teen pregnancy, drug abuse, etc., anxiety and depression comes out over and over in the Pew surveys, etc., of youth as the number one thing. We need to get about that. That's a great challenge. Of course, we have the challenges of the world that all have solutions if we do education right, because smart people will approach them. We have this anti-intellectual challenge to consider. I think the country is filled with I don't trust people who are telling us they're educated, and I fit into a certain category that I'm not. So we have to restore that relationship between people and start to value and honor and listen to smart people out there who just don't have a college degree, but nonetheless smart people, and there's plenty of them. We have to embrace that, my view, and I think that's a great opportunity. Parent engagement is a huge challenge for us and also a huge opportunity. The disinformation brought on by the social media, and sometimes with a Zuckerberg type algorithm, they'll feed me what I want to hear over and over, and it gets worse and worse and worse, no matter who we are. And we think it's getting better and better and better. I have my talking points. I'm ready to fight the neighbor. We have the parent engagement, and I think some of that wanting to bust up the public schools for whatever reason is a problem brought on by this misinformation. And we have to be careful listeners at first. I think building confidence means building from the fundamentals of clear expectations for engaging parents and community. How do we do that? And then how do we make sure it's meaningful engagement? And I think valuing our children from the human development standpoint, we got to make sure our education systems get that more. It's not your discipline, it's not your content, it's your children that matter. And all means all, regardless. And we have to figure it out. How do we help children develop from where they're at, that frontal lobe, that executive function set of abilities to self-control, to be less, to be more inhibited in many cases, or less inhibited in some, to be organized, to be logical in their thoughts, that frontal lobe, that executive function set of sub-skills, that's a huge part of the job. And I think most importantly, we should triple down, quadruple down on making sure we believe in, value and honor our democracy. It's not the situations of race theory. It's not the situations of what we're doing in the streets or police officers or Black Lives Matter, or all of that comes back to, if we value and honor those 7 articles, a 20-minute read of our Constitution, if we value that Constitution by making sure, I don't think we should teach that just twice in a school K-12. That should be every year. Most of our citizenry would have a hard time telling you what the 3 branches of government do, those first 3 articles. Who are they and what do they do? How are they limited? What's the military's function when they take that oath saying, I'll protect and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign or domestic? What does that mean? And how do we, as Ben Franklin challenged us, it's a republic. We the people. If you can keep it, he said on the steps to that lady when she said, what kind of government do we have? We have a republic if you can keep it. We got to triple down. We're the longest lasting democracy in the history of the world. And it's always on the brink. So helping people, the people that are talking about the Constitution, the question first becomes, have you read it? No, it's too complicated. It's 20 minutes. And then the amendments have happened through time to change the way we get back to how we operate under the Constitution. So those 27 things just happened. I think we have some good resources as educators. We have the National Constitution Center, of course. Of course, coming from my heart and my board service, we have the Rendell Center for Civic Engagement with Ed Rendell and Midge Rendell leading that. And so we have some tools out there that people can use, but we should. Now we have Act 35 in Pennsylvania that says schools are required to figure out some test of civics. What will that be is school district by school district. So double down, triple down. This democracy can change in a minute. And all of a sudden we're somewhere where we don't want to be, maybe. And to what end is unknown. I say we have something that was really built to last. Let's embrace it. That's my call to action. Is if I had one thing of that list, that would be the thing.
Thank you. If you're okay at this time, can we take a few questions from the chat?
Oh, of course. Thanks.
But take a look here. Has there been any real shift in curriculum standards to address DEI or address difficult history that provides some basis for the critical race theory in school tension?
If you look at our history standards, and I would encourage people to look at those civics and history standards under social studies, and you'll see an awful lot of making sure that our students understand what our country has been through, including things like Jim Crow laws and keeping people, including simple justice. So I do think we have good things in place, and I think most citizens in Pennsylvania and the country and beyond would say, yeah, of course you need to examine those things as social studies and civics teachers go. And I don't think we're teaching critical race theory like a law school would be doing or higher education might be doing in many places. It's just that it's a theory of how we are, where we're at, where we are with mostly adult functioning in terms of the society, from employment to banking to housing loans to housing to other things. Students, once they're developed in those 21st century skills, are able to get at and make the connections and join the adult world and eventually study, if they're in law school, critical race theory. But in our schools, we're pretty clear about the standards that we want, and we give voluntary model curriculum, and you'll see we're addressing diversity, and we're embracing it. And I think the vast majority of Americans, Pennsylvanians, are too.
Thank you. I think this question was addressed. Is there a dollar figure defined by adequacy?
Yeah, that's that $4.6 billion, the most recent Penn State study. The lawsuit started in 2014. It went to the Commonwealth Court. They rejected it because of the previous Supreme Court ruling in the 90s that said not a job for the justice system, it's a job for the legislature. But this Supreme Court today said no, standards have changed. Teachers and students are being evaluated by these standards, and they're all expected to get to a certain grade level. So we want to hear this case at the Commonwealth Court. Justice Jubileer will hear the case starting Friday. Anybody can tune in. It'll probably be on public television. You can listen to the both sides of the argument, and you'll hear it out. I can talk for days. I was superintendent of one of the original 5 districts that sued the government, and then the rural and small schools joined on. The NAACP joined on. A lot of people joined on as friends, family members, etc. And it will be, I think, a fascinating trial. What will happen will happen. My own prediction is, and I'm nobody to have any standing in this, of course, but my prediction is it'll be appealed and it'll go to the Supreme Court. The best case scenario from my point of view would be the court would say to the legislature, fix this, and perhaps we'll be like New Jersey or Massachusetts that didn't need court intervention to be smart about it. Those are very literate states now, and they have a very equitable funding systems.
So it sounds like we're most likely looking at a long time before any type of.
I think the decision would be within a year. And then I think that the appeals process would be in another year. That's just me, again, with no standing at all. It could happen much more rapidly, but 2014 to 2021, I've been patient.
A long time. We have another question here. Are schools compelled to incorporate Act 35 and the 3 pillars? When do they have to incorporate a civics exam? It seems more voluntary to me.
Yeah, it sort of is more voluntary because it's like the other disciplines, but they have to have a civics exam. I don't recollect off the top of my head the deadline for doing that, and I think it's a pretty rapid turnaround, and they have to incorporate Act 35 and those 3 pillars. Yes.
Thank you. Another question, you have spoken eloquently about anti-intellectualism, but I'd like to hear specifically about the anti-science mindset that seems to have developed over the last 40 years or so.
My father graduated high school in the 40s, and when he did, we had a little over 80% of our students graduating, but South Korea had about 40% of their students graduating. They flipped, and I think the Pacific Rim has turned on, even though they have great problems, especially in countries like China that's got a lot of soiled land and have so many people. They have their own sets of problems. But one thing they've done up and down is awaken to some enlightened period, it seems. Meanwhile, we have shifted to this idea of anti-science. And I think it's, again, about community conversation. It's a great opportunity for us to have conversations that go something like this. I'm probably not going to rely on some guy talking on the television if I'm in the middle of a major health problem. And if it's a cardiac problem, I'm going into the cardiologist as fast as possible. If it's a problem where I need an anesthetist for whatever reason, I'm probably not saying to the cardiologist, I hope you can do that by yourself, like Michael Jackson did. If it's a virus, I'm probably not going to my local chiropractor who can manipulate my bones and give me a spinal and muscular help. And I'm not listening to them when it comes to the science. I think what we've not done well, and it's sort of like the Constitution, we've not taught basic education to understand what is the difference between articles and literature compared to a good evidence-based study, trial, experimental group with a control group, and what comes out of that. And then if you can collect a whole bunch of them, what does meta-analysis mean? What do we talk about when we talk about effect size of something? So when we have that kind of conversation, I got to tell you the truth. Somebody sent me a curriculum for 8th grade honors science on the viruses. And I said, well, I have 45 minutes. Penn State created that. I'm going to do it in my basement here. And, I'll get up with the fundamentals of virus. Well, about 3.5 hours into the study and about 19 pages worth of notes, I'm not kidding you, I was hoping that somebody can share with me the 5th grade version. So this virus stuff is deep. And imagine if the 8th graders getting fundamentally at that level, what a person who's dedicated their entire life to the science of virus knows. We need to have these conversations early on, because once the general public has graduated high school, maybe with an empty diploma without the basic skills, it's going to be a much more difficult time to recapture the folks. So again, I said at the beginning, I think an elixir for all of our problems is a great education system. And I don't think you can outsource that.
We do have an add-on to a previous question with the dollar figure defined by adequacy. That was per student.
Yeah, it depends on the district you're in. So if you look at the funding formula, there's a weighted per student cost. So they give you 1 credit for having 1 student. So in Johnstown, we have 3,000 plus students. So we get 1 for each one of them. So now we have a score of 3,000. Then they ask us the question, what about acute poverty? And if we have a student in acute poverty, and by the way, Johnstown has 54% acute poverty. So they add 0.6 to each one of those individual students. Now that student is worth 1.6. If a student is in low income, it's 0.3. So some of the students will be 1.3. A very small percentage in Johnstown will be ones. So you have ones, you have a bigger group, 1.3, and a big group of 1.6s. You add concentration poverty. So if you have density, more than 30% of your population in that school district is in poverty, every student gets a 0.3 on top of where they were. And then if you have English language learners, it's an additional 0.6. If you have charter schools, yay, you get 0.2 for students that went out to charter schools. So you're getting some money back for them like we used to. And then if you're in a rural community, you get a sparsity size adjustment, a factor as a district. At the end of that, Johnstown might grow from 3,000 to 11,000 weighted students. So at the end of the day, well, they go through a process to say, how much is your district actually paying and how much can they afford based on their family incomes and based on their assessed value combined property values. They get a weighted adjusted count, and they take that weighted adjusted count of students. Now, Johnstown probably went from 8,000 to 11,000 because of that, because they don't have any property wealth or wealth. And now the school district is averaged, and what you do, you take all of the school districts, you divide them into Johnstown's, and you get Johnstown's percentage share of the new money going out. Fairly complicated, but really smart. It's the most equitable formula we could come up with. It's beautiful. It's in the law. However, it's only in the law for new money. I hope that answers the question about every student counts, but it's not across the state. Look, if I grew up in a house that's worth $700,000 and my parents are both physicians or surgeons, I'm going to be a 1 the whole way across that board. And that district's, obviously going to need less state money. Let me give you a great example. Melissa Jamula was the entire time growing up and to the superintendency of Reading School District. It doesn't get any more depressed and valueless than in terms of property value than what she was facing. It's a tough situation, and that school district gets rewarded greatly by this new money, but that's all they get because they're held harmless since '92 on other money. Melissa suddenly shifts careers and becomes the superintendent of none other than Upper Marion School District, where King of Prussia Mall and all that valuable property's at. They can make millions of dollars just by raising $500,000 of taxes. And she would whisper to me after appropriations hearings, Jerry, we don't need any of the state's money, please. I know our senators are saying to, or senator and representatives saying to you, and what does that mean for our school? It's like, you don't get any money, didn't you? You're not understanding this. But she would say that because they really had enough property tax money to, add the 4th tennis court or add great new biology labs or science labs every year and laptops galore for everybody. And it goes on and on and on what they could do. Meanwhile, Reading's looking for textbooks that are above 1970 copyrights.
Thank you. That's a good explanation. So it sounds like we have a good formula, but the money all the money needs to go through the formula.
Yeah, if we would put all the money through the formula, we'd have equity.
Yes.
But we still wouldn't have adequacy. The lawsuit is about adequacy. And then this might be the fix on equity writ large if you get adequate, because well over 400 districts have an inadequate amount, and well over close to 300-ish, and I have the number, per child have $2,000 or greater needs per child. You can go on, I'm going to show you this website, fundourschools.pa.org. You can go on it. Can you see that?
No.
All right, I'm going to come back to you. I didn't share the screen, that's why you couldn't see that. So this schoolfunding.org is an advocacy group. So opinionated, biased, all for settling this case on behalf of the plaintiffs. But nonetheless, they have an interactive map that looks like this. And you can go on to your school district. Here's the 5 that are soon, but you can go on to any of the 500 districts and you can pick your district, and it's not interacting for me right now, but you can pick your district, click on it, and it will show you the amount per student that's needed to get the adequacy for that district. So that's a pretty nice addition, comes from Matthew Keller, Penn State University College of Education. And you can get this information per district.
That's a really nice tool.
Yeah, it's a pretty neat tool, and I think Penn State should be applauded, even though we want to beat them in all sports when you work for the University of Pittsburgh.
Well, I think we've covered all the questions in the chat, and Dr. Zahorchak, thank you so much. That was such an informative session. We really appreciate you sharing your insights and perspectives. I know I learned so much, and I hope our attendees did as well. Thank you very much. I also want to thank our attendees, of course. I'd like to thank the League of Women Voters of Greater Pittsburgh Board of Directors for helping with the presentation, and also the Education Committee. And I wanted to mention to everyone that the Education Committee meets the first Wednesday evening at 7 p.m. Of every month. And if you're interested in attending, please feel free to contact me, and I'll explain more about the committee. And of course, you're certainly invited to join us. At the end of every program, we like to introduce an action or advocacy item that you, our attendees, can participate in if you so choose. And I'd like to introduce Michelle Knoll at this time. She's our Director of Advocacy, who will talk about our advocacy item for this program. Michelle?
I want to thank our speaker. As an educator, I really appreciated so many of his viewpoints and really found it an inspirational talk and really learned a lot, even as an educator. But as an advocacy chair, I'd like to suggest that all our league members who attend or observe a school board meeting in their district. This is especially easy right now because most of them are in Zoom. The bulk of your property taxes supports your school district. And as a former school board director, I always remembered that my mission was to see children through 13 years of education to graduation. So we encourage your league members to use the form that you will find in the voter. Kathy is going to write in articles in the voter this month, to use the form you'll find, which helps you to observe a government meeting. And, hold your board members put their feet to the fire, see if they're dedicated, see if they're doing their jobs, because you are paying for the school and you are hoping that they're going to educate these children so they come out and they become functioning members of society. So we want to thank our speaker again this evening and hope that you'll take some opportunities to actually go out into the community and look at some school issues. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michelle. And many thanks again, Dr. Zahorchak. That concludes this evening's program. Have a good evening, everyone.